Thank you, Robert. Thank you, all of the friends from AmCham, and it's great to be back in Hong Kong for ever so briefly, my second home, as I like to call it. It's a fantastic city. And I commend you in your program design for picking a topic that is near and dear to my heart and likely to be an important one in shaping the relationship between the U.S. and China and with lasting impacts, not just on this region, but on the global economy for decades to come. And it's a particular pleasure for me to share the podium with AmChamHK, who I've known for a while and long admired. So here we sit today, September 7th, hours away from what is likely to be another significant escalation of the tariff war between the United States and China, probably the largest escalation of tariffs yet in this seemingly ongoing battle. But notwithstanding the ever-escalating tariffs, I don't really believe that the U.S.-China dispute is truly about trade imbalance. I think it's more of a strategic clash over innovation and technology, the holy grail of any nation's economic prosperity. Yes, we know there's a large trade imbalance between the U.S. and China, and it's actually growing wider as we speak. But this imbalance is just as much a function of America's macroeconomic problems as it is a reflection of unfair China trading practices long alleged by the Washington Consensus and now underscored by the shrill rhetoric of the Trump administration. The U.S. has a chronic shortfall of domestic saving. A couple of numbers. Our net national savings rate, which is the combined saving of individuals, businesses, and the government sector, was just 3% in the first half of 2018. It's up a bit from 1.9% over the post-crisis period, but it's less than half the 6.3% average in the final 3 decades of the 20th century. Lacking in saving and wanting to invest, consume, and grow, any basic course in macroeconomics will tell you that the U.S. must import surplus savings from abroad and run massive current account and trade deficits to attract the foreign capital. Therein lies the folly of the Trump administration. The U.S. had trade deficits last year with 102 countries. It's a multilateral problem. By opting for these budget-busting tax cuts late last year, our already depressed domestic saving will move sharply lower in the years ahead, pushing our current account and trade deficits even wider in the years ahead. Moves to ameliorate this problem with tariffs on China will only backfire. The Chinese piece of the trade deficit will shift to higher cost trading partners of the U.S., putting more pressure on American consumers. And that's happening as we speak. There can be no bilateral fix for a multilateral problem. Trade deficits and the press they get every day and in a few hours from now are really a foil for a more profound struggle between the U.S. and China. A recent White House policy paper says it all, and I quote, "The Chinese state seeks to access the crown jewels of American technology and intellectual property." White House advisor Peter Navarro, whose name I really don't like to mention, goes on to add that, quote, China has targeted America's industries of the future. If China successfully captures these emerging industries, America will have no economic future, end of quote. These charges from the White House, from Navarro, draw heavily on the findings of a so-called Section 301 trade investigation conducted by the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and published last March. They present what seems to be a formidable case, 182 pages long, 1,300 footnotes, alleging technology theft, violation of intellectual property rights, and the like. The conclusions of this report, in my opinion, are wide of the mark in 4 areas. One, joint ventures. The USTR report alleges that there are forced technology transfers through the JV structure, but that overlooks the most basic aspect of JVs. 2 partners working together willingly in the context of commercially and legally binding agreements to jointly create a business that requires a sharing of personnel, systems, and processes. That was certainly my own experience as a senior executive working closely with a joint venture with my former firm, Morgan Stanley, and our partners at the China Construction Bank in building China's first investment bank, CICC. I can assure you, in my 15 years of working in this joint venture, never was I forced to turn one thing over to my Chinese partners. The second element of the USTR's Section 301 report focuses on cyber hacking, which has been a problem over the years, but this was addressed very explicitly in the so-called Sunnyland Summit of 2015 between President Xi and Obama. And since then, cyber incursions have been sharply reduced, a point conveniently overlooked by the March Section 301 report that focuses on cyber hacking activity that predates the Sunnyland Summit. Thirdly, the USTR also charges China with technology theft through its, quote, going out policies of acquiring U.S. companies and their proprietary systems. These allegations are exaggerated. Tabulations by the American Enterprise Institute in Washington find that of China's 228 outward-bound M&A transactions over the decade ending in 2017, only 16 of them were in the tech sector. By contrast, 51 of them were in the property sector over the same period. And fourthly, the USTR report focuses on industrial policies like Made in China 2025, the Artificial Intelligence Plan for 2030, claiming that the state subsidies and support of these programs gives China an unfair advantage in the acquisition of foreign technology. Yet industrial policy is something that all major advanced economies have practiced in one form or another. It's true of Japan, it's true of Germany, and it's true of the military-industrial complex that does industrial policy in the U.S. Through the Pentagon. Unfortunately, there's really a painful element of hypocrisy that runs through the USTR's accusations of Chinese intellectual property theft. In the 19th century, Great Britain, continental Europe, and yes, even the United States, all engaged in a multitude of flagrant abuses of technology transfers. There are countless examples of industrial espionage, illegal recruitment, the kidnapping of foreign workers who had knowledge of proprietary production techniques, trademark counterfeiting, and the artificial protection of interlocking patents. This is not to say that China should be excused just because others did the same, but historical context and precedent can hardly be ignored in putting today's accusations in perspective. The allegations leveled against China by the U.S. trade rep make it sound as if the Chinese are thieves and interlopers, that they have no rightful claim to the hallowed ground of innovation. Yet this overlooks the fact that ancient China was the world's preeminent innovator. From agricultural production to textile weaving, from paper and printing to missiles and gunpowder, from magnetic polarity and navigational guidance to breakthroughs in civil, mechanical engineering, and nautics, from discoveries of synthetic insulin to ferrous metallurgy and ceramic technology, China's extraordinary breakthroughs in science and technology came well before the 18th and 19th century agricultural and industrial revolutions in Europe and the United States. By the late 11th century, China's per capita iron output was 5 times the European average. And by the 13th century, China textile spinning was operating at efficiency levels that Europe would not enjoy for another 500 years. The real question is not whether ancient China knew how to innovate, but why the China of the 14th century didn't capitalize on its innovative culture with its own industrial revolution. China's lag in science and technology became especially acute in the first 75 years of the 20th century, brought on by the combination of the collapse of the late Qing dynasty, the National Revolution, and the inward-looking focus of Mao. But this gap was more a function of systemic failures in China's political system than a loss of the creative DNA of the Chinese people. The same culture that gave the world magnetic polarity, gunpowder, and paper is perfectly capable of doing it again. While the innovation debate is of critical importance to the current dispute between the U.S. and China, it raises an even deeper question. Will China make the transition from imported to homegrown or indigenous innovation that is absolutely essential to avoid the dreaded middle income trap, which often derails most developing nations? My answer to this question is there are several reasons to believe that China will, in fact, make that transition very successfully, and in fact is doing it right now. And let me just give you 5 reasons why. One, China is moving to embrace the Silicon Valley hub model, the subject of a cover story in this week's Economist magazine. But hubs provide the cultural assimilation between leading universities, venture capital investors, and serial entrepreneurs. A tabulation of global hubs right now shows that China has established 17 tech hubs. The most notable is right here in the Pearl River Delta, the Greater Bay Area. But there's also Z Park in Beijing, the Guangzhou Innovation Hub, and other high-profile hubs in Shanghai, Pudong, and most recently, the Tsinghua Institute for Artificial Intelligence. A second reason why I'm optimistic on Chinese innovation is startups. Hubs foster startups, providing great incentives for a new generation of innovators and entrepreneurs. And over the past decade, China's startup culture has really hit its stride. It now has over 160 unicorns, private companies with valuations in excess of $1 billion each, versus 130 unicorns in the U.S. And China's unicorns span the gamut, from the fintech of internet finance to a vast e-commerce platform to online travel, cloud computing, big data management, new energy, and logistics. Moreover, there's a large and growing population of listed companies which are already on the leading edge of the global innovation curve, from e-commerce and social media giants like Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com, and Baidu, to world-class leaders in DNA sequencing and biogenetics such as BGI and Hengrui, to high-speed rail, autonomous vehicles, and of course AI, where China and the U.S. are the global leaders in what could well be this century's most important technology gambit. The third reason to be optimistic about innovation is strategy and governance. This is where ancient China fell down, and I think the high-profile industrial policies, Made in China 2025 and AI 2030, are signs that modern China will do it differently. A fourth reason is that China's DNA as an ancient innovator is alive and well today. China's educational reforms are now turning out university graduates of more than 1.7 million scientists and engineers per year. And it's not just quantity, the quality is increasingly impressive. From nanoscience and nanotechnology, to quantum networking, to stem cell research and regenerative medicine, to gene editing and the genetics of cancer research, to AI-related breakthroughs that put China only, at most, 1 year behind the U.S. in AI. The new innovators of modern China speak volumes to China's own, to borrow Navarro's phrase, crown jewels. And fifth and finally, the reason I'm optimistic on Chinese innovation is R&D. Data from the U.S. National Science Foundation put Chinese spending on overall R&D at $409 billion in 2015, the latest data point we have. And that's nearly double China's spend of 5 years earlier in 2010, and second only to the nearly $500 billion in the U.S. Significantly, 84% of overall Chinese R&D spending is earmarked for what the NSF calls experimental development, making China the global leader in this critical leading-edge category. Equally compelling, the U.S. National Science Foundation reports that in 2016, China surpassed the U.S. as the world's leader in academic science and engineering publications. So there's the evidence, and to me, it really takes us to an even bigger question, and that is the following. Is China coming full circle from an ancient civilization that once led the world in innovation to a modern nation now focused on research, scientific development, indigenous innovation, and commercialization of these activities? And I think there is a pretty compelling case that that may well be the case, and the USTR's stress on the dark side of Chinese innovation literally allows no consideration of this possibility. So let me end where I just started a few minutes ago with my concerns about the clash. Much has been made over the race for technological supremacy as a decisive factor in the struggle for economic dominance between China and the U.S. But I would oppose to you this morning there's an alternative interpretation. Each economy needs the productivity payback from technology and innovation for its own purposes. China to avoid the middle income trap, and the U.S. to counter the risk of stagnation that may well arise from another productivity slowdown that appears to be underway at this point in time. Resolving the innovation dilemma does not imply defeating the other in the arena of global power. This contrast between the zero-sum imagery of a conflict and a win-win outcome of mutual success could well be of great potential importance in understanding and ultimately resolving the strains in the U.S.-Sino relationship. The alternative interpretation leads to a very different set of issues, not just for China, but also for the U.S. As an American, I'll put it quite bluntly, is the China fixation of the U.S. Trade Representative, to say nothing more of the extreme charges of President Trump and Peter Navarro, the real challenge that the U.S. needs to face in the years ahead? My answer to that is no. In the end, America's race, like that of most nations, is more with itself than with a purported foreign adversary. America's scapegoating of China would make Don Quixote blush. It is a convenient excuse for ducking the tough issues of economic strategy that the United States has avoided for decades. Namely its saving and productivity imperatives. Both the U.S. and China face formidable economic challenges in the years ahead. They both win if they solve their own problems. They both lose if they attack the other in a destructive and diversionary trade war. Over time, of course, there's a growing risk that perception becomes reality. The U.S. body politic is in danger of convincing itself that China now needs to cheat in order to regain the edge, and in doing so will stop at nothing short of the outright theft of America's crown jewels. China, for its part, is increasingly convinced it is being victimized by an American containment strategy aimed at limiting its geostrategic role as well as limiting its progress on the road to indigenous innovation, sustained development, and prosperity. The longer this dispute continues, and I'll close on this point, the deeper those convictions are likely to become ingrained on both sides of the relationship. And then the long and tragic history of struggles between rising and ruling powers, the so-called Thucydides trap, will become all the more relevant. So resolving this innovation dilemma, in my view, is absolutely key to avoiding that outcome. Thank you very much.